Welcome to AINdebrief, where we take a look back at the most important aviation news stories of the past week by AIN editors who covered them. I'm AIN Alerts editor Chad Trottvetter. In this week's episode, AIN London-based editor Charles Alcock and FBO editor Curt Epstein talk about business aviation sustainability efforts in light of the 50th Earth Day, which was celebrated on Wednesday. Meanwhile, as the COVID-19 crisis drags on, Editor-in-Chief Matt Thurber discusses remote audits for flight departments during the pandemic. Air Transport editor Gregory Polek highlights more airline bankruptcies. Wichita-based editor Jerry Siebenmark explains how pre-owned business aircraft sales are faring. And Washington, D.C. editor Kerry Lynch gives an overview of AIN's webinar this week on supply chain during the COVID crisis. Charlie, let's start with you. Wednesday was Earth Day, and Farnborough Airport's kind of been leading the way for the industry in sustainability. Can you just talk about what they've done and what they're planning to do to further that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, call me biased because Farnborough's my local airport, but this is a good news story. And what they've done, they've been working on this for close to 9 years now. They set out the goal of becoming business aviation's first carbon neutral airport. And what that means is they've both eliminated the amount of carbon that they generate from their operations, and we'll get to that in a minute. And then any carbon that is still emitted, they offset it through approved programs. And if you read my article at AIN Online, you'll get full details on exactly, why these programs are credible. But they have made a meaningful difference. And in 2019, last year, they achieved their goal of being the world's first carbon neutral business aviation airport, meaning they're either whatever they are still emitting, they're offsetting, but they've more than cut in half the number of carbon emissions that they're even having to offset from about 3,600 tons in 2017 down to almost 1,600 last year. And they've done it in all sorts of ways. They've almost completely replaced the old heating system that they use. There's no more oil heating being used. They're using far, far more efficient energy distribution systems. They've got meters absolutely everywhere so that they can make sure that energy isn't being wasted. They've got some solar panels. They have also completely eliminated any landfilled waste from the airport. It's quite remarkable. They're recycling just about everything, and they're recycling it all locally. They're not shipping stuff halfway around the planet to do it. Again, a lot of detail in my article, but I do think it's impressive. And, business aviation is so often an easy target when it comes to environmental concerns. And in this case, Farnborough Airport can truly say it's making a difference.
Are they interested in having sustainable aviation fuel?
Yes, they are. And they have had a limited experiment with that. They freely admit that at the moment, certainly here in the UK, the supply of sustainable aviation fuel just isn't assured enough. There just isn't enough of it to really make that a meaningful part of their operations. But they say they're ready to do that. As soon as the fuel can be supplied, they're very, very willing to stock it and they want to promote it. And I think that's the next step for them.
And they also want to add more solar panels, and they use some electric vehicles on the ramp, and they want to do more, right?
Yes, they do. They are planning to install more solar panels. And in fact, another London area airport, Biggin Hill, is talking about having a solar farm with panels right across some of its green space. They're going to add more electric vehicles. They're adding local electrical distribution points across the ramp so that, when we eventually have electric aircraft, they'll be more readily recharged where they need to be. And so it's an ongoing program. They haven't just achieved carbon neutral status and have said, right, that's it. We'll take the rest of the decade off. They're still working on this.
Excellent. Thanks, Charlie. Continuing on the Earth Day theme, Curt, you did a story on the progress of the sustainable fuel industry this week. How's that going?
Sure, Chad. Well, the use of sustainable aviation fuel is one of the key pillars for the aviation industry to meet its stated goals of carbon neutrality and reduction in emissions and all those things. And as for business aviation, there were a couple high-profile events over the past year to introduce the use of SAF to the community and to show that it's a perfect drop-in replacement for fuel. And it's slowly and very slowly making its way into the business aviation system. Most of the capacity of SAF that's being produced now is locked up in offtake agreements with airlines. United Airlines pumps about 3 million gallons of SAF into the general fuel supply at LAX, and they reap the benefits and tax incentives and whatever else they might get from it. But every airplane that refuels there leaves at least with some molecules of SAF in its fuel tanks. Now, one of the concerns that the industry has right now is with the price of oil. And if you saw earlier this week, the price of oil tumbled, and this was an artifact of the oil market system, but at one point it was actually negative in terms of cost of barrels, dollars per barrel. And that's a huge drop from even a couple months ago when it was between $60 and $70 a barrel. So there was always a price delta between the use of SAF and regular jet fuel, and how that was covered was through various incentives, tax credits, various things like that. And what this has done is widened that gap, because for those who are still flying, the price of jet fuel is now as low as it's been in decades, whereas the price of SAF, which is a limited process right now, is still very high. So that's a concern that the industry has right now.
But that's just a short-term problem. Longer term, they're looking for a lot more production. So what are they thinking on that?
Well, that's correct, because right now the capacity is somewhere around, I believe, about 30 million gallons of SAF produced a year. And the Commercial Aviation Fuels Initiative, CAFE, they've done projections. They've basically gone and looked at companies and seen what they're planning. And by 2022, we will have reached about 420 million gallons of SAF production worldwide. And if you extrapolate that out to 2024, they picture that number doubling to over 800 million. So the industry has plans for expansion. But what the COVID-19 crisis is going to do those plans remains to be seen. It could slow them down, but it probably won't derail them.
And there's a little bit of good news, I suppose. The head of CAFE said that potentially there could be more tax incentives and rebates and things like that for alternative fuels as a result of the relief bills, right?
There could be. In my conversation yesterday with Steve Sonka, he did say that his association, his organization, I should say, has been contacted by various legislators who are working on the various relief packages for the industry. And he would not be surprised if there are some amendments in them for the use of sustainable fuels. But again, he doesn't have his crystal ball, and that's also up to being batted back and forth in Congress. So we don't know how that's going to shake out, but he said he would not be surprised to see such things coming in for future legislation.
Okay, thanks, Curt. Let's hop over to Matt. Matt, also during the COVID-19 crisis, flight departments can't do audits, or maybe they can, I guess, if they're doing it remotely, right?
So, Chad, during this coronavirus pandemic, with everyone locked down and unable to travel, flight departments that have audits scheduled, and most of them do it every year, might have trouble getting an auditor to be able to travel to their facility. Plus, there's all the social distancing issues if they are able to travel. So here's an auditor who came up with a creative solution. The McDonald's Corporation Flight Department in Chicago had their audit scheduled about 3 weeks ago. And this was all scheduled well before the pandemic happened. And when the captain and safety manager, Brandon Vondrak, was talking to the auditing company, Rick Malzinski, founder and president of the Business Aviation Safety Consortium. They were trying to figure out, well, how can we get this audit done and still have a high level of safety and low risk? So Rick said, well, why don't we just do it remotely? And that's what they did. And it worked out really well, Chad.
Is this going to change? This is a temporary thing for the current crisis, but do you think this will change the future of auditing? Will there be more virtual auditing? How did the auditing go? What do they do?
Chad, I think it could change the way things are done where, in this case, Rick would have traveled to Chicago from Connecticut, and the audit takes 1.5 days, so he would have been there at least one overnight, plus meals, plus travel expenses. So the customer actually saved money on this audit from that standpoint. But in terms of the actual audit itself, it went really well. There were 3 people on the flight department side involved in it, including Brandon, the safety officer, a flight attendant, and the director of maintenance. And then Rick back in Connecticut running the audit. And keep in mind that, an audit involves a lot of pre-preparation beforehand. So by the time the audit happens, a well-prepared flight department will have all of its documents ready to go, everything ready to be looked at, people ready to be interviewed. And that was the case in this particular situation as well. So using iPads at the flight department, they were able to show all the documents required to Rick and have any discussions about any issues, show him equipment that is involved in the audit process, anything he needed to see. And in fact, Rick said in many ways he felt like it was a better audit because they not only were well prepared, but it was easier for him to say, hey, show me this and show me that. And there were very few distractions, like, he just gave the example of while you're in the middle of an audit, somebody says, let's go get coffee. And then you all go get coffee, and half an hour later, you get back to work. In this case, it was very efficient and easily accomplished in the budgeted day and a half.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Matt. Greg, so as the COVID-19 crisis drags on, we're seeing some airline bankruptcies. Can you just go over that?
Yeah. It's been a pretty ugly week so far in terms of bankruptcies, and there doesn't seem to be much sign of an improvement anytime soon. Just to start off, 4 of Norwegian Air subsidiaries that had employed pilots and flight attendants went bankrupt. And the prospects for the 4,700 people that were working there do not look good at this point. It seems that IATA's call for more government help from the airlines has proved kind of prescient, because in Norwegian's case, the 4 subsidiaries were based in Sweden and Denmark. I think 1 was in Sweden and 3 were in Denmark. And those countries have come under some criticism for being kind of slow to offer aid to the airline industry. Then we had Virgin Australia that went into voluntary administration as it continues to look for government support. Australia has also been sort of slow, it seems, at least that's what the critics say, in offering aid. It's interesting, the situation in Australia is interesting in that there have been relatively few cases of COVID there. I think there are less than 100 deaths from the virus, but there's still a real lack of confidence in the economy coming back anytime soon. And IATA has blamed that for weighing down the sector in general, particularly in Australia, because they saw, like in China, things kind of did turn around a little bit, not to the full extent, but they use the example of China and Australia as 2 sort of differing scenarios. One, in China's case, where the government was aggressive in propping up the airlines. In Australia, where it's been a little more conservative. Just yesterday, German regional airline called LGW went into administration. It was flying Dash 8s, wet leasing Dash 8s for Eurowings, but Eurowings basically stopped all their operations. So LGW had nowhere else to go, really. And there really aren't a lot of other wet lease opportunities out there at this point. So they're trying to find. They haven't given up, but it doesn't look good for them. Another one was Air Mauritius, and that was yesterday as well. They declared insolvency yesterday, and it had already stopped flying, but it planned to resume operations on May 15th, and that looks very unlikely now.
Is there any more on the edge, or are we just seeing the weaker players come out now?
Yeah, it looks that way. I mean, first of all, South African Airways, which I think in December declared a form of bankruptcy in South Africa, U.S.-style bankruptcy in South Africa. It looks like they're going to liquidate totally. And, it tried giving it another go at restructuring early in the year and with government support, but this time the government said it has no interest in trying to keep the company afloat. And there's actually talk of starting a new national airline at some point there. And then, of course, recently there's been a lot of speculation about Virgin Atlantic. They have been making noise about getting government support, or they feel that they're going to really not be able to keep things going the way that they are now. A lot of people in the UK, though, are complaining about the fact that, Richard Branson, who hasn't paid UK taxes in about 14 years for the airline because he somehow based his holdings in the airline in his island in the Caribbean, Necker. Now, this is just this week. We have Flybe, of course, went out of business not too long ago. Trans-States Airlines in the U.S. and Compass Airlines, those two airlines are part of the same group. But there may be some I'm missing as well.
So there probably will be more before we see all the airlines actually start service.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that the countries where the governments have really been aggressive in supporting the industry, those airlines are obviously in the short term going to be fine, at least until in the U.S. they have until September 30th. And then after that, they kind of then they have, up until September 30th, they're not actually even allowed to lay off any people in return for the support that they've received. But after then, who knows what can happen at that point? But yeah, I mean, it doesn't look good. I listened to an IATA conference this week, it was a conference call. And they really think that the governments need to step up now, and or it's going to get uglier and uglier.
Right. All right. Thanks, Craig.
You're welcome.
Jerry, you listened to a webinar from the International Aircraft Dealers Association this week. What are they saying about pre-owned business aircraft sales?
Well, it's really the main topic that emerged out of that was sort of when can we expect the market to bounce back? And depending on who you talk to, it could be anywhere from 1.5 to 2 years. Michael Amalfitano of Embraer Executive Jets expects sort of a U or L-shaped recovery, and that could take as many as 2 years. However, Richard Avalofia of the Teal Group is expecting a little bit shorter of a recovery, one lasting about 1.5 years, 18 months, and that's something that would follow the development timeline for a vaccine to the coronavirus. And what's interesting is during the webinar, which was really about the state of the biz jet industry. At least that's how they put it. What was interesting was that they did the Dealers Association did a poll during the webinar, and of those responding to the poll, 72% said they were very optimistic about the fortunes of the pre-owned business jet market, and that was despite 65% indicating they expect aircraft pricing to drop anywhere from 10 to 15%.
Kerry?
Yes.
AIN had a webinar on Thursday, and you listened in. And it was about supply chain during the COVID crisis. So what's the takeaway from the webinar?
What's interesting is those in the supply chain market in the MRO segments are not immediately seeing that pinch, although they do think it's coming. And where the problems have already existed or bubbled under the surface are going to get much, much worse. They call the supply chain, the people who participated were Todd Winter with Mid-Continent Instruments and Aaron Hollander for First Aviation Services and Mark Dobry, who's with Standard Aero Business Aviation. They called the supply chain already fragile. It has already been in distress. And the reason for that is there's a lot of single points of supply for many materials. And if something happens with that one area, then the whole supply chain gets bottlenecked up, and that they saw that last fall. So the concern is particularly downstream with raw materials and things you use for forgings, castings, that sort of thing, that supply may slow. And if that happens, it'll create pinch points all the way through. So they do think that they're going to have to diversify their suppliers, but they say this is very, very difficult. It takes a long time to get these people spooled up, to have the quality control, to get the approvals necessary. So it's very easy to stick with what you know with one supplier. But they see a time where you're going to have to branch out and have multiple options to draw upon. Another key issue that's happening is, the global integration of companies. And so much of the supply comes from other areas, in particular Asia, particularly in the areas of electronics. And so they do see that as a problem. And right now, they're not seeing too much of a cost increase in getting the materials. There are things and, secondary pop-up things like hand sanitizers and PP equipment. But the costs are still stable, but right now it's too soon to see what's going to happen down the road with that. And, the expectation is everything may get a little more costly as time goes on.
And with supply chain, it's not just OEMs, it's also end users getting parts, right?
Yes. And that's why it was so important to talk not just with suppliers of OEMs, but with the MROs themselves, because they need the parts to do the repairs. And some of the things they suggested is, and some of the things they are focusing on is, increasing their own engineering in-house so they can become more self-reliant, stocking up on their own inventory. So in case something, dwindles down the road, they have what they need because the manufacturers are demanding just-in-time delivery. And reaching out to maybe those small companies that might assist them or provide supplies to make sure that they're still doing okay and they have everything they need. And there's a real vulnerability there because if someone gets sick with COVID, they have to shut their facilities down and then that stops everything. Meanwhile, the OEMs or the customers are still waiting for their repairs or for their parts. Todd Winter mentioned that he's seen, as a matter of fact, this as a little aside, he's seen that with the manufacturers, that demand for parts has started to ebb over the past 3-4 weeks, maybe as much by 10 to 20%.
All right. Thanks, Kerry. Hey, Matt. So speaking of webinars, we have another one coming up on Tuesday, and it's on the topic of aviation training during the crisis. So can you tell us what who you're speaking with and what the topics will be specifically?
Sure, Chad. So we're going to hold a webinar next Tuesday, April 28th, and the subject is going to be the aviation training segment and how pilots and technicians are trying to continue learning and what effect the pandemic is having on training operations. So for this webinar, we've invited 3 panelists: Dr. Kenneth Burns, who is Assistant Dean of the College of Aviation and Associate Professor of Aeronautical Science and Chairman of the Flight Training Department at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University's Daytona Beach campus, and Chris Ranganathan from CAE, he's their Chief Learning Officer, also an active pilot. And from Fulcrum Labs, we have Chris Joyner, Senior Vice President of Brand Experience. And Fulcrum has some interesting online training systems. Okay,
great. And that's at noon on Tuesday, the 28th. And if you want to register, you can go to www.ainonline.com. Thanks for listening to AIN Debrief. Another podcast episode will air next Friday. In the meantime, go to www.ainonline.com for the latest news from AIN.